Well, hello and welcome to the All Nations Church podcast. I'm James Aubrey, and immediately you'll notice that I'm on my own. I haven't got Emma or Kier with me today, but I promise you that normal service will soon be resumed. We trust that you guys really enjoyed season 5, A Life Less Ordinary, and we're working very, very hard at the moment on season 6 and season 7 because we're so keen to get them to you. But today we've got the chance to have a very special guest for a very special bonus episode of the podcast. And I'm really, really pleased to welcome Andrew Wilson to the podcast. Andrew, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, James. What a delight to be with you.
Andrew is the teaching pastor at King's Church in London. He is the curator of the phenomenal Think Theology conference that takes place there every summer. And he's the author of myriad books, including Echoes in Exodus, Spirit and Sacrament, The God of All Things, The Life You Never Expected, and Remaking the World. So, which many of you who are listening or watching will have read some of those or come across some of them. But as well as that, Andrew, would you just be happy to say a little bit about yourself and your kind of background for people who might be encountering you for the first time?
Yeah, sure thing. So I always, when I say that I'm 46 as well, like an opener, I always think people's ages matter to people. And then everyone often laughs in live audiences, but I'm 46 years old. I'm married. I've got 3 kids, 2 are just teens and then a 9-year-old. As you said, I'm a pastor of a church in London. It's a sort of it would be, in our context, a large multi-site, charismatic-y, Pentecostally, reformed-y church, which has enough in there to bamboozle everybody. A big part of our story, as you may have even alluded to with one of the books, is that our 2 older kids have quite significant disabilities. So that's been quite a big part of our lives. And another quirk is that, as well as writing a lot, I also live in a different town to the place where I'm a church pastor, because our family live in Eastbourne, but I commute up to London on midweek and then on Sunday. So I have a slightly strange life. I'm not a sort of typical, church pastor, I guess, in that sense. There's a lot of things that are a bit unusual, but I have a great joy of being able to do some teaching and writing and sometimes traveling as well. And I love, understanding God's word and applying it to the culture. So, is that the kind of thing you mean as an intro?
That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and the book you mentioned your family, and the book you and your wife wrote together, The Life Either You Never Expected or We Never Expected, whether it's America or the UK.
You noticed.
Yeah, it's one of the best books I've ever read, that my wife's ever read, and we've actually lost our copy because we've given it away to so many people. But I think if people haven't read that, then it's a phenomenal read and an amazing testimony. I'd like to ask you a question based on something you wrote, Andrew, which is always a dangerous thing with authors. I'm notorious for quoting things back to people that they've said, and they're like, I never said that. But last year you published a book called Remaking the World, which was all about the year 1776. It's the only book I've read that manages to quote Hamilton, The West Wing, and Donna Tartt all in one go. It's kind of all around different ways that events in that year have shaped the world that we live in today. And at the beginning of that book, you say this. You say, ours is a forgetful age show. Lots of us do not remember the names of our great-grandparents. Perhaps it's unsurprising that we don't remember their world either. The rate of change in the last 2 centuries makes the past feel much further away than it actually is, which inclines us to fawn over the future and either patronize the past or ignore it altogether. And I read your book last year when it came out, and I reread it in preparation for this podcast. And that really struck me, that quote. And I wanted to kind of begin our conversation by asking you, what are the benefits, do you think, of being aware of our roots, specifically in Christian history, but also then in kind of cultural and social history more widely?
So I think, and actually I do 2 pages on this in a church history course I teach, where I have sort of 10 headings, which I won't go through all of. I wouldn't remember them all off the top of my head. But I think it's a really important question, because often people don't find it initially interesting, and so they aren't sure why they should give any time to it. I think some of it is you don't really understand who you are and why you think the way you do without understanding some of your history. And one of the reason that matters is because if you don't realize how contingent or how likely your beliefs could have been to be something other than what they are. So you take things for granted that you can't take for granted. You think, well, everyone thinks this, because you don't realize where that belief came to you and why that belief seems so innate to you, and obviously wouldn't have to someone 300 years ago, and still doesn't to somebody living in a house from a different religious tradition, who has 8 people living in their home rather than 4, and might only live a mile away from you, but sees the world in a very different way. And if you don't know your roots, and you don't know why the beliefs that seem innate to you and the practices and habits and things that you just do in your day seem so obvious, you can actually lead to huge misunderstanding when you're trying to engage with other people, because you haven't clocked the origin story of your belief. So you aren't really sure who you are. You just think, I thought everyone was like this. And I think probably in a culture that's very homogenous, that doesn't matter very much, because most people do share those assumptions. And so it's fine that people, if you lived as a peasant on a farm in 14th century Germany, it wouldn't really matter that lots of people around you didn't know their story very deeply beyond a generation or two, because if that was the case, because most people share it. But if you live in a very diverse society in which there are a lot of people who've got really quite profoundly different beliefs, and you're surrounded by people and your kids are at school with people who've got a very different take on major questions of meaning and life and origin and God and redemption and sin and the future and so on, let alone politics or, culture or whatever, then if you don't know your roots and you don't understand where your beliefs and your practices and your values come from, you will lead to a lot of misunderstanding. You'll probably end up being proud if you're not careful, and you will at best find it difficult to reach people like that with the gospel, or to understand why they might struggle to understand it or to grow in it. And at worst, you could become a very arrogant, annoying, bumptious kind of person, because you sort of regard things as, well, as the Declaration of Independence in that year you're talking about says, self-evident. Like, of course everyone believes it. What are you talking about? So I think those would be some cultural level reasons to know your history. I think there are good reasons to know church history specifically as well, but that's at a level of culture, I think it's very important.
And when you kind of look back to the period that you've described then, so kind of going back into the 18th century, for example, what similarities are there, first of all, between the kind of culture we'd be living in now and they would be living in then? Or did you find that there aren't any similarities at all?
Oh no, there's loads. I think so, and it's interesting. I think sometimes you see them through particular individuals. So for me, Ben Franklin was probably the person who felt like I could have almost bumped into him. You read his letters or the things he says, the way he thinks, his sense of humor. There's a lot of things about him that I feel. Obviously, he looks. If you've ever. Probably many of us never handled $100 bill, but if you have, Ben Franklin's on that, and you look at him and he looks bespectacled and grey-haired, long, and he obviously belongs to another century in his appearance. But as soon as you interact with the kinds of things he says, you think there are a lot of assumptions here about progress and creativity and money and work and social ethics and family and geography and the place of the West in the world, many, many things like that, which even though Ben Franklin wasn't a Christian in the sense that I am or you are, he actually had got a lot of those assumptions from Christianity, and I have too. So you get some individuals like that who can feel very modern figures. You also get some people who, of course, don't at all, and you're very surprised to find that they were alive at the same time. But I think when you begin to, you get people who really do feel quite, if I can use these sort of slightly classy words, classist words, but like bourgeois, or they feel like middle class modern people. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying they sound like people in all sorts of areas. But as soon as you take technology out of it, and the fact that they would have written their S's as F's and all sorts of other quirks like that, you find I could have had a conversation with this guy down the pub, I think. Or if I did, there'd be some things we wouldn't connect on at all, but a lot of things we would just take for granted. So I think at least in the Western and the English-speaking late 18th century, there's a lot of overlap. And it is really fascinating, I think, particularly because some other differences are so large and you find yourself assuming all sorts of things that they would never have believed. But a lot of those things themselves have grown out of assumptions that actually you and those people 250 years ago had in common.
And do you think if going back to that time period as well, would there be kind of very stark similarities between us as Christians and Christians back then as well? Would you kind of find it very easy to interact with them and their kind of the way they practice their faith?
That's a good question. I suspect, I mean, some and some as always, but I think that might be, I think our experience, if we were to suddenly get dropped into a late 18th century evangelical service, obviously, again, technology, language, wealth levels apart, which obviously would be very different. I think there would be a lot of overlap. And I think one of the things I try and draw out in the book actually is the degree to which late 18th century developments in some fairly obvious integral parts of modern Christian spirituality were extremely formative. So I think obviously you wouldn't be singing songs on guitars. But the kinds of songs, actually some of the songs will be exactly the same. And so you might go in and you think, okay, hymn number, whatever is Rock of Ages or Amazing Grace or God Moves in a Mysterious Way, which are all written in the mid 1770s. And you definitely know Isaac Watts, Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun, or When I Survey the Wondrous Cross would be very familiar. So you'd have a lot of touch points there. The Wesleys, they just sing many of the same Christmas carols. The Wesley's hymns would be very well known. So you'd have a lot of overlap there. I think you'd find there the prayer life and the sort of personal piety of the Methodists would resonate. It might be a bit intimidating, actually, because they're often very, very serious people. There'd be less wry in the sense of less of the sort of self-deprecating, undercutting the earnestness. Whereas I think contemporary British Christians, there's a lot of that, and that would be we would pride ourselves on it. I think that would be much less there. There'd be much more what we would think of them as being quite intense, earnest people, I suspect, for better and for worse, I'm sure. There would obviously be some very significant social and cultural differences. So that they would be in the 1770s, people are beginning to see the evil of slavery for what it is. But I think depending on where you are in the Western world, if you were dropped into an American church, you would find it very shocking the way that they thought about black people, for example, and not just black people actually, but many people in the church, in the global church, who are not white or Western. So there would be some obvious social differences as well. But I do think that in terms of piety, preaching, prayer, worship songs, liturgical communion, those sorts of things, you would find a lot that you would have in common. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, even as you might be standing in a room surrounded by people with wigs and frock coats and powder and all sorts of things. You think, what do these people do? So I just think that is what makes this period quite interesting and appealing to us in many ways.
Yeah, so no guitars, no slides for preachers, no overhead projectors, but most of the rest of it would be.
Well, a lot of it would be, yeah. They'd probably have no, but I think honestly, for many contemporary Brits, the lack of diversity would be a very noticeable feature. You would just suddenly think, wow, everyone in this room looks almost exactly like me. And I think that would be, and that obviously shapes the way the church is done in a way that I think you would feel was very weird. But I think in terms of the basic elements of Christian worship, you would find a huge amount in common.
Yeah, and you mentioned diversity there, and of course you're part of the leadership of a very kind of diverse church in London. I mean, I think I've heard you say it's kind of a third white, a third Caribbean, a third other ethnicities. So is that fairly accurate in terms of? Yeah, it's
probably, we would say a third of people in our church are probably West African origin, a third are probably Caribbean origin, a third are white or somewhere else. So yeah, that's just. But my point I'm making is, even no matter how, you could be in a very rural church in South Wales and you would still find the church was significantly more. There's more different kinds of people probably in your church than there would be in the 18th century, just because the world has changed a lot in that period.
Yeah, but did you find the fact that you're working in such a diverse context and congregation, has that made you think more or think differently about kind of both church history and kind of cultural history?
Oh yeah, I really hope so. It has a lot. So I didn't know very much. I don't think I'd really thought about some of the issues we even started talking about in this conversation. So where you get your beliefs from, what seems intuitive to you. That a lot of those things, I think I would have seen them at an intellectual level, would have found them interesting, but I don't think I'd realised how visceral they are and how strongly I might feel certain things and how much my view of the world needs to be challenged. But then I'm quite old now. So I would say that even in the 10 years, I went to join the church that you're talking about in 2016. And in the 9 or 10 years since I've been there, I would say that a lot of the Western world has changed, even in that period, quite a lot with respect to the way we think about these things. Had much more conversations now about some of the issues that I was really. I mean, I remember a guy who's a good friend of mine, from Jamaican origin guy, in our church. introducing me to the word woke for the first time when I'd been there about 3 months. Now, of course, that is just like a kind of hackneyed, overused. It's kind of, we've gone through the tunnel where it means something positive, then through the tunnel where it means something negative, and out the other side where people now go, this is just a blunderbuss word. It means everything and nothing. In the space of literally 8 years, because when I first heard it, I was like, I've never heard that term. What does it mean? And I was astonished. And that was a silly example, but it actually in some ways encapsulates that change that the Western world has gone through a lot of change on, particularly on its thinking about, race, gender and sexuality, which are completely distinct, but all have been shaken in a very similar way, actually, in overlapping ways between 2015 and now. Some of that is due to what's happened in American politics. Some of it's due to legal changes and so on in the West. Some due to the sort of diminished influence of institutional Christianity and various other things as well. But so in other words, where I am now is where I was then is probably closer to where a lot of people might be now, but it wasn't where I was then. And so that's an interesting thing to have walked through. So yeah, I have learned a lot, but I suspect that a lot of those things will be things nowadays people would find fairly intuitive or straightforward.
And do you think that pace of change is still upon us? Do you think it's slowing down? Do you think it's kind of stopped in any way, shape or form?
I think the narrative at the moment, which is difficult to appraise when you're in it, but I think the narrative at the moment that I would find most persuasive is that it's less a sort of solid trajectory heading in one way, but it's more a sort of a pendulum on those particular issues I'm talking about, not on pace of technology or pace of economic growth, those sorts of things. You draw different curves for all of them. But I feel like on some social issues, there's a sort of, you get a pendulum swing, because what typically happens is that overreach, basically, that people, societies, when a particular side is in the ascendancy, they go further than they can, and then there is a backlash against what they have said or done, and because lots of other people eventually go, I'm not having this. And we saw that where you might sort of get it looked like everything was heading inexorably to the, if I can use the words left and right, but you know what I mean, like inexorably to the left, and 2020 would have been a real big moment of that in reaction to Trump, which was a right move and that sort of thing. You get left. But then by about 21, 22, you start seeing the first signs of a pendulum swinging back. Issues in the UK, I think, a canary in the coal mine on issues of gender ID, and Scotland actually was one of the first places I thought, oh, this looks like it's beginning to swing back, which is interesting. And then suddenly, in 2023 or 4, you get a whole load of other changes in the political sphere, in the social media sphere. People start talking about a vibe shift. Twitter becomes a right-leaning platform rather than a left-leaning platform. All sorts of things like that, which in their own selves seem silly and little, but collectively make you feel like you're running this way. And now lots of people are producing Netflix shows about the corruption of young kids by the manosphere, and it's much more right-leaning. So, and of course, that will also overreach, already has, and there will be a backlash against that, and it'll swing. So I think that's more the narrative than a sort of a trajectory which is slowing. I think it's more like a pendulum which is swinging on those issues anyway. Yeah.
So you've done a fair amount of work in terms of understanding kind of church history, recent cultural history, and you've given a kind of very good summation there of kind of some of the ways that we've been affected by the last kind of 5 to 10 years, and particularly how that affects a diverse community of which the United Kingdom is full of. How have you found that those things have affected your preaching and teaching of the church that you lead and look after?
I think this is a risk of being a very. You'd have to ask them, because with the church, but I think it's made my preaching more interesting, which is not in itself that much of a big deal, it might say. But I think at a personal level, I think what it does is it makes it easier to connect what's going on in Scripture with things that are concerning or exciting or interesting or noticeable in contemporary culture, because it gives you a framework to think about why those things in contemporary culture have not always been as they are. In fact, they weren't even as they are 10 or 15 years ago, as we've just been saying. Yeah. And so I think, quite early on in my time at King's London, we did a series on Exodus, and I think the way I preached on obviously you're going to, in a black majority church, you preach on the issue of slavery and Exodus. You're going to do it in a hopefully quite intentional way, because you're aware of what a big part of the story it is for so many people in the church. But I think doing it through the lens of seeing cultural change and that sort of, like beginning to learn a lot about the history of the last 200 years or before, means that you're able to make to tell the story in a way that connects even contemporary changes and issues with deep historical changes with scripture. And I think sometimes, I mean, this could just, I don't know, I don't want this to sound like a plug for my own preaching. I just think you're asking the question, how does it affect it? And I think one of the things it does is it enables you to join dots for people between the world of scripture and the world of today through. So I'll give you one example. By studying the late 18th and early 19th century, you start learning about slave Bibles, which are when basically publishers in London, a few miles from where my church is, are literally removing whole swathes of the Bible in order to produce an edited Bible to give to slaves on the plantations in the West Indies, so that they won't read the bits about liberation from slavery. So they take out, you're reading Genesis. I think in Genesis, I'm going to forget now, but I think in somewhere in Genesis 45 or early Genesis 46, suddenly Genesis stops and it reappears in Exodus chapter 18 or something. It's literally removes the first 15 chapters of Exodus because it's all about slaves being free. I mean, it's just vile. And you're reading and thinking, these guys were they would have called themselves Christian printers of Bibles. They're in Clerkenwell, like just up the road from me. It's where I used to live. And they're producing Bibles to give to slaves to make sure that the slaves don't realize that the heart of God is for the emancipation of slaves. I mean, it's just absolutely baffling. And that's an example of a thing. And now, of course, in my church, that lands heavy. People go, well, and a lot of people have not heard that. But that's like a kind of late 18th, early 19th century thing, which enables you to connect the reality of the Bible with the reality of the 21st century by means of 1800s, which is when these Bibles were printed. So that would be an example. And I think there's probably lots of examples of things like that in which it has really helped me, because those historical stories don't only explain how people in prior generations understood scripture, they also explain why the racial issues we're dealing with today in our communities are what they are and have not fully gone away and still need to be addressed and spoken about, because that history goes pretty deep.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. The story that really struck me as well, reading or rereading Remaking the World, for example, was the story of David Hume on his deathbed being visited by Boswell.
James Boswell, yes. Yeah.
And Boswell, the shock for Boswell is that Hume doesn't believe in the afterlife. And I think, as you say, the shock for us is that Boswell believed he was a Christian when he was such a rascal.
Sorry, anybody always gets points for using the word rascal in a podcast. That's great. Yes.
I think that's the politest way that I can use to describe it.
It is, but there's something very 18th century about the word. It's almost as if you were going up to him and saying, "You, sir, are a cad and a bounder," and slapping him with the back of your hand, challenging him to a duel. It's excellent.
Well, maybe I belong with Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century as well. But it kind of that story also made me think about how differently our culture today would relate to Christianity, would relate to the afterlife, for example. I read Oliver Twist on holiday maybe last year or the year before, and what had struck me reading that was how massively concerned that the characters in that book are about their lives and what's going to happen to them in the afterlife. I mean, Nancy is constantly worried that, you know, what she's doing now is going to cause her to go to hell, which doesn't come out in any kind of modern presentation whatsoever. And so I wondered how therefore, you're kind of, how was your interest in that period of time, and how was the some of the things that you've looked at in terms of contemporary culture, how has that also affected the kind of the ongoing mission of the church? Is that kind of given the church kind of greater confidence to proclaim the gospel to a culture that actually has far more Christian moorings than it realizes? How has that kind of affected the church?
So again, I think on the church level, I think, again, to some degree, you'd have to ask them. I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate the extent to it. It's not like everyone in my church is thinking about the things I've written about in this book. Most of them haven't read it. Most of them, but I do think that the church the church with a capital C, you know, the worldwide church and the church in the West has a lot to gain from, and is subtly influenced actually by people who are telling the story of the West as a Christian thing more and more. And I think so some people will read it at a very deep dive level. They'll read Larry Siedentop or Tom Holland or whoever it is, Christian Smith, or, you know, Charles Taylor, telling the story of the West in a very academic, cerebral way, which I love and you do. And look, people probably listening to this conversation, as long as are probably more likely to be at that end. Then I think you have people in in the middle who might be trying to popularize or translate that into ordinary church life, people like me, but people who have written books that are more accessible than that book. Glenn Scrivener's The Air We Breathe would be a good example, and actually a bunch of the people I work with at the Keller Center who are trying to help make some of this stuff accessible. And then you have ordinary people in the church who are they've got jobs and they're busy lives. They're not thinking about these things a lot of the time, but it is nevertheless often quite reassuring and encouraging to see that many of the good bits of Western culture would not be what they are were it not for their Christian roots, and in fact are very hard to sustain without those Christian roots. And the way that affects, I think, evangelism and mission is that the line I've often used now is that it's much easier to say to somebody, this is what you believe and here's why you're right, than this is what you believe and here's why you're wrong. And there is a time for saying there are some things about the belief you have that I don't share and I do think are wrong. But it's much, much easier to engage with people when you say, but the belief that you hold, so someone says something very basic like, I just can't believe you believe in a God you can't see, which is what my cousins used to say to me when I was a child. And you go, well, actually, you believe in all manner of things that you can't see and can't prove. But an example would be, do you believe in human dignity or human rights or something like that? And they go, well, that's just obvious. And they say, no, that is an example of something that there is no way you would believe if it were not for Christianity. And with that one, you've got lots of hostile witnesses. You've got lots of non-Christian thinkers. Yes. And I mentioned a number of them in the book. I mean, some of them would be very Christian sympathetic, like Tom Holland. Some would be robustly not Christian, like Yuval Noah Harari, who's sold 30 million copies of a book basically saying, we're a post-truth people. We believe in human rights and dignity and the value of every life, even though it's absolutely not founded in reality. The only reason we believe it is because of Christianity. Well, that's quite reassuring in a way for ordinary Christians, because you can say, you and I have actually got a lot in common here. I agree that I've, to whatever degree, thought through the reason why that belief holds in a way that you may not have particularly thought to worry about because you don't believe in God. But actually, were you to take God out of it, that belief wouldn't stand up. And that means I've then got quite a positive basis on which to engage with you in this conversation. Depending on the Christian and what their friendship circle is like, that may not apply. But I've had conversations of this nature with dads at football. Like you know what I mean? Like my son plays football and I'm standing on the sideline with it. And we have got into some of these issues there, like not in ways that are exclusively, strokey beard, ivory tower meetings, but you obviously you have to adapt to and try and learn from the person you're talking to about where are they and what do they believe. But I do think the church in its evangelism and mission has a lot to gain by thinking through some of these trends.
Yeah, I was in a conversation recently with some school teachers around helping children with, in England, they're called special educational needs. In Wales, it's called additional learning needs. And we were talking around some bits and pieces. And I said, where do you think you got your desire to help them from? It wasn't from the Greeks and the Romans, it was from the Christians. And there's that kind of desire to help the weak, care for the vulnerable is entirely rooted in Christianity. Yeah.
Yeah, so and that's obviously a fun thing to talk, and you don't want to do it as a gotcha, like, oh look, I've just caught you out. But you're absolutely right, and I think you're saying there is something in you that chimes quite deeply with the teachings of Jesus. You in the end, the first should be last and the last should be first. Blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who blessed are the poor in spirit. All of that is very, very foundational gospel 101 stuff. That the Magnificat is being played out in the lives of special needs, the people who teach my children, who are picking them up on a school bus right now as we're talking, are to some degree motivated by an ethical vision that would not exist were it not for Jesus, Mary, James, Paul, all the rest.
And then on the flip side then, what do you think that's kind of distinctly, or what do you think that stands out that's distinct in the gospel in a culture that is so often unconsciously Christian? What is it that we, if you like, what is it that we hold out and say, no, this remains distinct regardless of all the moorings that you have that are unconsciously Christian?
Well, it depends on the culture, doesn't it? I mean, I think there would have been Glenn, who I mentioned a moment ago, Glenn Scrivener, is very good on this. He said, you used to have people believing in people would all agree on nature and they struggled with grace. In the modern West, you have people all agree on grace, but they struggle with nature. So it kind of, the idea that God, I mean, they don't actually believe in grace in the full Christian sense, but the idea that God, were he to exist, would be an infinitely benevolent being who would want you to be forgiven from your sins, restored to right relationship, adopted into his family, given everlasting life. People go, of course, I'm great. What's the problem? Of course, any God would surely be like that, wouldn't he? The idea that God might then say, there are certain ways in which I have made my world, in which it flourishes if you do this, but not if you do that, in which there are certain things that are true of the fact that you are male and female, or that down is not the same thing as up, or whatever it might be, that there is going to be judgment and accountability. That's the bit that modern people go, whoa, 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 you can't say that. Which, of course, is the mirror image of what you might have had 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or or would have today if you were to say the same things we're saying in Yemen, or wherever. So I think it obviously depends on the culture, but I do think that Glenn's thing of grace and nature is quite a helpful shorthand for going, yeah, that is, there are a lot of people within a few hundred yards of where I'm sitting now, and probably where you are, that would assume a specifically Christian account of love, goodness, mercy, grace, hope, kindness, basically all the fruits of the spirit appear on people's tattoos and yard signs and bumper stickers, don't they? I mean, kindness, joy, yeah. Love, peace. You think, whoa, it's a very interesting thing. But that is not that's not the virtues you'd have had in the ancient world. They all come straight out of Galatians 5 or whatever. Love is love, or kindness is everything. But that wouldn't have been what Marcus Aurelius would have said, or Aristotle, or whoever. And it still isn't what a lot of people would say. And you're beginning in the pendulum swing I mentioned earlier to see a swing back against it towards the sort of on the way onto the right of people going, no, we have overemphasized Christian virtues, a more sort of Nietzschean view. In which case, then the distinctiveness, if the world goes more in that direction, the distinctiveness is the things that a mushy, liberal-leaning Brit like me would go, well, these are obvious. Actually, in some parts of the West, those things are not obvious. They're being strongly critiqued. So I think it just depends where you are and what bubble you're in as to what elements of Christianity are prickly and edgy and what elements are taken for granted.
Yeah, and you mentioned Glenn Scrivener a couple of times, in his book, The Air That We Breathe, is a really, really excellent book, I think. And I heard him speak last year in London, and his stories about how he had kind of led his neighbours to Christ and witnessed very faithfully to people in his community kind of demonstrates the things that you're talking about there. So like presuming that, like as in Glenn's case, people around us are kind of coming to faith in Jesus from this kind of contemporary culture. What do you envisage are some of the kind of discipleship challenges that we have with people who are coming out of that culture today?
Yeah, so I mean, again, it depends on the particular subculture that they've been formed by. Because I've taught this before in a setting where I was kind of assuming that everybody was broadly in the same kind of, leftish leaning, guardian-y account of reality, graduate-y, that sort of thing, and then found some guys going, the people we're trying to reach are not at all shaped by that. They're much more on the more right side of it, and as a result, right in the political, not correct side of it. And as a result, you're colliding with very different issues. So I think discipleship challenges obviously vary there. I think so my church, again, probably might be quite different from where you are. I don't know. That actually, I think because of the part of London we're in and the influence of Christianity in West African and Caribbean communities, doesn't necessarily mean that obviously everybody's natively Christian or anything like that. But there are very few people in my part of London who don't have a whole bunch of pretty Christian assumptions, not only on the grace side, but actually on the nature side in that sense. And some, I would say not an insignificant number, for whom actually the nature side would still be stronger than the grace side. People who would say, I actually do believe these things are just given realities of the way God has made the world, and I do believe in God, but I struggle with a more Christian doctrine of grace and the substitution death of Christ, or the resurrection from the dead, which is always, you get that even in the New Testament, don't you? When they heard about the resurrection, they went, some mocked. So that's probably always going to be an offensive doctrine to everybody, and you will always have to disciple people through it. But I think the discipleship challenge, I think sometimes is actually the same at both ends of the spectrum. And I think it is to sort of front load some of the challenges that people are going to face in their discipleship journey into the process of inducting them into what Christianity is in the first place, and preparing them for baptism. A lot of churches would do it, call it catechesis or something like that, where the challenge is often to say, we have got to make this hard up front. Going to say, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about dying to self. We're talking about renouncing final authority over your money, your body, your time, all these things. And obviously, people living that out takes a lifetime, as it does for you and me. But I think that sometimes the discipleship challenges of trying to make it too easy early, because you want to win people. And then at some point they collide with, hang on a second, you're asking me to give up everything. And I think Jesus is, no matter what kind of person he's engaging with, will often put that challenge very early. It's like, well, one thing you lack, sell everything you've got. Then you can come and then we can talk. Or no, leave the bed dead to bury their own dead. In a culture where that's just shameful, you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. And so I think that sort of the discipleship things you have to put in, the roadblocks you have to lay out and say, this is what it will cost you, will vary dramatically from person to person, bubble to bubble, city to city. But I think that practice of saying discipleship challenges are often about front loading those things which it will be for you, and saying, this is what it means to follow Jesus. And C.S. Lewis I've often quoted it. He said, Christianity is something that if it's easy at the beginning is extremely hard. And if it's hard at the beginning is extremely easy. Because you basically either do or do not deal with the great idols in your life and realize that you're going to have to give them all up. If you don't, your life is a constant battle against things you feel you should have. If you do, your life is a constant story of gratitude of, wow, God's given me some of these things back and I didn't expect to have them. Yeah. And that is easy to say, but I think there's a lot of truth in it as well.
I like that a lot, and that kind of comes back round too to the kind of period of time you wrote about in Remaking the World, because both kind of the Methodists and, I mean, the Moravians are slightly prior to, they're around the same time as well, aren't they? But again, lots and lots of kind of high cost, great devotion, kind of giving up everything to follow Jesus. And they're some of the movements that kind of budded and seeded and flowered into some of the things that we're experiencing today.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I agree. I find them very challenging. And as you say, this is related to the earnestness thing. And I don't quite know what to do about some of that, because I think it is, I can swing on my own pendulum where I can see some of the earnestness and intensity could be joyless. Some of it could lead to what you and I would regard as an extremely, way too single-minded response to calling, as distinct from responsibilities and obligations to something like family. The stereotypical missionary who goes, right, that's it, I'm off to the nations and my wife's got to come with me, and if my children all die of malaria, then so be it. And she, now obviously in many ways you'd say, well, a lot of parts of the world wouldn't have the gospel now if people hadn't done that. And I go, yeah, that's true. And I also think, yes, but is that actually what in a number of these stories you go, I'm not sure that's what laying down your life for your wife means. What do you know what I mean? It's like it's more like you laying down yours for mine. And so there are lots of examples like that. And I think you could say the same of any generation. People will say the same of us, not probably about the same things. They will say, well, there was this sort of, they practiced self-care, that generation in the early 2020s, and they were very good at it. They were very good at making sure, oh no, we won't go into work because obviously we might get sick, and oh no, we won't go. We don't want to do anything. But and they all sat in comfortable rooms, but in the end, they really pulled their punches on this and this. Or something. I don't know what they'll say, but they might easily say that, as we can look back. And so I do find some of those critiques that I might feel inclined to issue give me pause. Because I might say of the Puritans or the Moravians or the early Baptist missionaries, yeah, but what about this, and this? Look, what about the way they thought about race, or what about this, that, and the other? I think, yeah, but every generation will have faced that judgment in subsequent generations by others, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right to make that judgment of them, or that others will be to make it of me. So, on some of those things give me pause. I'm not sure that the self-undercutting, ironizing British habit is quite as infallibly a good thing as even I, in my flesh, naturally would think it was. And I'm not sure the comfort is as unalloyed good as we might think it is either. But again, it's easy to say that from inside, surrounded by books and wearing headphones talking to you.
Yeah. What do you think then are some of the kind of challenges and opportunities that we have in this kind of cultural moment then, in terms of, so what kind of, based on some of those observations, what do you think our opportunities are?
Do you mean in sort of reaching the world? Do you mean in terms of growing?
Yes, definitely, yeah.
So I think in the general sense, the answer, I guess, is that in every generation, the way in which the life of Jesus, if it's being lived out in the church, strikes people as arresting, novel, surprising, jarring, challenging, will vary. But if you live out a godly life, you're going to find people will notice that. And some of them, whoever wants to lead a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And some of them, that men may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. And funnily enough, the deeds that in one generation might provoke persecution, in another generation or part of the West might provoke admiration. And so, again, I keep saying it, that will depend on where you are. But I think in a setting like mine, one of the things I think I've always felt is true of the church, but is particularly seems to be true at the moment in the last even few years, is that the experience of community and corporate worship in community in particular is very often very moving in ways that people don't understand or can't quite put a voice to when they come and see it. And people who you think on paper, if they were debating these things in the abstract, would not really have very much time for the idea, see something, and they often say things like, it's very nebulous. They're like, I felt something, or I just couldn't, or, we've had so many people, they go, I just couldn't stop crying, or things of that nature, where they're like, something is chiming with my spirit, and they wouldn't use that language, or my soul, or there's a longing or an ache in me that is being temporarily and puzzlingly satisfied by being part of this community of people. Some of it is actually just the sheer practice of Christian friendship and hospitality. Like, I think I'm just struck by how rare it for many, even I would say quite affluent middle-class people who you'd think would have people in and out of their homes all the time, just how unusual in many parts of Britain saying to people, come round to my house and hang out and have a meal with us is. That's just not how a lot of ordinary people my age who are not Christians really function. They don't expect to be in intergenerational, interracial, interclassal gatherings every week in which they meet and rub shoulders with and stand next to in the queue for the toilet or coffee or communion or whatever it might be, with people who are totally different from them. A lot of my friends who I used to work with when I was working in the city, who I still, they just don't interact with people who are from a totally different social milieu to them very often at all, unless they might volunteer in a charity sector or something. And even then, that's a pretty small slice. And it's not a relationship of parity, which, of course, the church by design is. So there's a lot of things like that where actually just being the church is really arresting to people. And it's very appealing and attractive. And it's often also puzzling. So it weirds people out. And so people on paper would say, well, the church got all this evil, terrible history, Inquisition, slavery, robbery. And of course, which we do. And I'd be one of the first, we've said already, I'd be one of the first to say. But when they actually see a real church and spend time with a group of Christians who all know each other or whatever, they often go, this is amazing. I can't. I remember Chris Moyles he's not a name that, younger people would know, but people are, your age or my age, I expect would. This is about 10 or 15 years ago, but he was on Radio 1 and he just accidentally stumbled across the baptism service in Kingsgate, where Dave Smith leads in Peterborough, a similar church to ours. And they'd just been baptizing people on Easter Sunday, and it was on TV. And Chris Moyles talked about it on Radio 1 for about 15 minutes. He just couldn't stop going on about it. He kept stopping his sentences going, and it was amazing. It was amazing. They was baptized. It was amazing. He just kept saying it. And it was lots of people, we all shared it because it was like exciting. And then you move on to the next thing. But I think something of that is still there, that no doubt Chris Moyles doesn't go, what must I do to be saved? Or Jesus is risen or anything like that. I expect, for all I know, I don't think he has. But he saw the church in action and went, what in the world is that? I've never seen anything like that. And I think that's a powerful witness.
Yeah, we had a guy who got saved recently, or he joined the church recently, and he'd come from a religious background, another part of the world, different religion altogether. And he said the biggest thing for him in coming to faith in Jesus was that he couldn't believe that anybody would pray for somebody else. So he said all his bringing in his other faith had been you pray to God for yourself. It's all to do with you using your spiritual cachet with God. And he said the first time he came to church and someone said to him, "Can I pray for you?" It completely blew him away. The fact that Christians would use their, if you like, their spiritual cachet with God for the benefit of other people.
Access. Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and I love that idea that really if you like, the best means of mission that we have is for the church to be the church in all its kind of weird, wonderful, glorious spirit present self. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and to some degree, I know that's not really an answer to your question of what uniquely do we do in this cultural moment, because that's always been the case. I just think in some ways that the aspects of the witness of the church gathering together that particularly resonate with contemporary people, where the major challenges people know they have are things like, it might be things like loneliness or anxiety or isolation or homogeneity, or where you go, people, they do come to a place, so places which are very diverse, communitarian. You in theory at least give up a lot of your individuality, and not your individuality, but your individual freedoms are sacrificed for the good of corporate. That places like that are a very profound witness in an individualistic culture like ours.
Yeah, definitely. And I also, when you see people really, I know you're a big fan of talking about joy, and I think when you see people enjoying God and enjoying each other's company, it's a real, genuine, life-affirming witness that there's something going on.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time and for an absolutely fantastic and stimulating conversation. And who knows, maybe we can tempt you to come back and join us sometime in the future. Would really recommend your books to people. Check out some of Andrew's preaching online. You can get it on the King's Church podcast feed or elsewhere. But thank you ever so much for.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating conversation as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And we'll speak to you again soon, hopefully. Thanks for joining us, everyone. God bless. Bye bye.